Hello everyone, it's Greg here from Edinburgh Renaissance Fencing Academy for another online fencing tutorial. As usual, we'll be talking about Grassi's late 16th century Italian fencing system today, but this time, instead of the rapier, we will be examining the two-handed sword. This is just going to be a brief overview, a kind of introduction to this topic. Now, Grassi's treatise covers a number of different weapon forms, but the basic concept of the system is that you learn all the core principles of fencing with the rapier, and then you learn how to adapt those principles to the other weapons, which is in fact how I try to teach things at ERFA. So today we'll consider the two-handed sword as an example of this sort of adaptation of the core techniques. There's going to be two sections to this presentation. Just now I'm going to explain some basic principles and demonstrate them inside in this room in my flat, and then later on I'm going to go outdoors and demonstrate them properly where there's a bit more space. So first of all, just a brief note about the weapon. The sort of two-handed sword that is described and shown in Grassi's treatise is like this. Obviously this is a synthetic training weapon, but it's the correct size, proportions and design for Grassi's two-handed sword. For demonstration purposes, while I'm indoors here, I'm going to be using this, which is a steel training weapon form of an earlier medieval design of two-handed sword. It is, of course, significantly smaller than the later Renaissance one, but that makes it more convenient for this sort of space. Just please bear in mind that the strategy, the techniques are designed for the bigger sword. Finally, if you don't have access to either the medieval or Renaissance form of two-handed swords, but you're still interested in pacing through the techniques, don't worry. A big stick or staff like this is easily sufficient to kind of work out the basic mechanics and go through some basic training drills. So this one is actually a bow staff from a Japanese martial arts supplier. These are readily available and not very expensive, so I recommend these if you don't have access to a good training sword. Okay, so I'm going to give a really quick overview of how to adapt the core principles and only the core principles of the rapier system to the two-handed sword system. So without further ado, let's get going. First thing to consider is the guard stance. So if I take my sword in one hand, first of all, if you imagine this is the rapier, this is of course our low ward guard position with the rapier. Low ward with the two-handed sword, without the finger over the quillon, so it's a very simple grip like this, and the other hand on the pommel. It's actually on the opposite side of the body, so it's to the inside of the lead leg rather than the outside, but otherwise the same idea. So the tip of the blade is slightly up and angled slightly across your body. Similarly, high ward looks like this with the rapier. With the two-handed sword, it looks like this. Okay, so tip angled down and across and protecting your body that way. With the two-handed sword, these guards can be reversed, so we can take it with a left lead stance, like so for low ward, and like so for high ward. Obviously, your arms are crossed in the opposite stance. That's basically fine. So there are effectively four guards. There are two low guards and two high guards. The wide guard, the middle level one, isn't really used in the two-handed sword system. Okay, that's it for guards. So that's how to adapt the guard posture. What about attacks? Obviously, you can make powerful cutting blows with the two-handed sword. Something like this. And as usual, we're using this torso rotation mechanic. So this is a fendente mandrito blow with the two-handed sword. Okay, it's very similar to the same cut with the rapier, just with the more powerful two-handed grip. For the thrust, there are two forms of it. The standard thrust, the normal thrust, is where we simply push the sword forwards for the shoulder and step, and we end up something like this. Now this thrust is relatively short actually because of the two-handed nature of the stance. So the Grassi recommends extending this thrust by actually removing the lead hand at the end point of the action. I'm going to slightly change my angle here so there's a bit more space, so I'm going to be thrusting in this direction. So this is the normal thrust, the short thrust, extend the sword, step. The extended version, extend the sword, pass forwards with the rear hand coming off, and then recover by pulling the sword vigorously backwards. So once again, step and push, follow through, recover. Step and push, follow through, recover. This one-handed extended thrust appears to be unique to the Grassi, but it can actually be extremely effective. Okay, last thing we're going to talk about is the parries. There's very little to do to adapt these actually. From low ward, if an opponent attacks us on our outside line, we simply apply the standard Grassi body mechanic of rotating the torso and moving the sword to deflect the attack. So move the torso, deflect the attack, and step. If the attack instead comes on the inside line, we just make the opposite movement. We rotate the torso this way, raise the sword to deflect, and we support it with a circular step of the back leg. I'll just move forwards a little to get some more space. So, parry and step. And obviously, an appropriate riposte can be added on top of that. So we riposte by thrust if possible. If the tip has come offline, we riposte by cut. So, parry, thrust. Parry, cut. And on the opposite line, parry, thrust. Parry, cut. And of course, the riposte could also be done with the long extended thrust rather than the short thrust. And finally, if we're attacked at an awkward angle, particularly if an attack's very low or very high, you can use the hanging parries as well. So a hanging parry, low to the outside line, we just dip the tip of the sword and support it with the slope step. On the inside line, dip the tip of the sword and support it with the circular step. And that's basically it. All of the principles of recovering and defending yourself as you recover are just the same as the rapier. So there are surprisingly few adaptations to move to the two-handed form of the sword. So that's basically it as far as an introduction goes. We'll pause briefly here to relocate outside where I can demonstrate these techniques with the full-sized training weapon that I have down here. So I shall return very shortly in the other location. Hello, so here we are in the outdoors location. So I'm going to demonstrate some of the principles that I showed earlier using the full-size training weapon. I'll just go through these more or less in order. If you want to practice this at home, obviously you should repeat each of the movements a good number of times, slowly until you're confident with it, and then add in a little bit more speed and energy. As always, pay attention to body mechanics first and foremost, and remember to include this slight torso rotation mechanic to drive and control the sword. It's particularly important for a very large weapon like this. Okay, let's go. Just note that I'm going to show everything from low ward only for the purposes of this video. Short thrust. extended thrust. Cut. Inside parry and riposte. Outside parry and riposte. So that's basically it. Of course, you can also practice the low hanging parries as well. I'll just very briefly demonstrate that. So to the inside line. To the outside line. And of course, you can add suitable ripostes onto the end of the hanging parries as well. So that's the end of today's tutorial. Hopefully it gives you a good overview of the Grassi two-handed sword system, which is an adaptation of his core rapier system. That's it for now. I'll be back shortly with another tutorial. Take care.